In previous Tech Bites, we've talked about how we can use live optics to get a view on a customer environment, including what their compute environment looks like from a CPU, gigahertz, and core count. But once we've got that information, how do we make some decisions on what CPUs we propose for a future state solution, particularly if the customer has an older infrastructure that has got some older style CPUs. So on modern CPUs, we typically tend to see a really high core count per CPU, but compared to some of the previous generation chips, maybe the gigahertz looks a bit lower. So how do we weigh all those factors up? Well, we've got a tool that enables us to do that. So if you're a Dell EMC channel partner or Dell EMC team member, then we have access to this CPUMeter, as it's called. Now, the CPUMeter uses industry standard SPEC benchmarks. So SPEC benchmarking is a way of, the way I describe it is a way of comparing the horsepower of a CPU. And what this spreadsheet does for us is provides us an easy graphical interface that's is pulled together by one of our colleagues out of Italy who does a fantastic job maintaining this for us. And it's a great tool to enable us to have a metrics-based discussion with customers around why we are suggesting the CPU that you're suggesting in whatever solution you're putting forward. So this is the spreadsheet. Probably the two most used tabs really are these, comparing 2 CPUs or comparing 4 CPUs. And it's really quite simple to use because all we're doing here is selecting the CPUs that we want to get some metrics for. So let's just go through and select something here. I'm just going to randomly select some bits and pieces. We'll look at some current 2nd gen scalable Xeons. So once you've got your CPUs selected, now you're presented with all this information. So some of this is quite easy to interpret. Obviously, total cores and threads available across your CPUs. The amount of power that the CPUs are taking, this can be quite important for a lot of customers today. We also have the integer spec speed that's for integer operations, and we have the floating point speed. And up here in this graph, we have the spec rate or performance. So I'm not going to go into details around how you interpret all this spec rate versus spec speed, but I am going to say for most environments where we're talking about a VMware virtualized environment, or actually probably any virtualized environment, then as a general rule, we can look at the integer information versus the floating point information. Again, as a crude generalization, if you're more into computer science, computational type workload, then floating point may be more, may provide a better example of the horsepower, again, of these CPUs. But for general virtualized environments, the integer rates are what we're interested in here. Now, I'm going to show you another spreadsheet that I've actually put together, and we'll talk about how we can use that information to assess CPUs for a VMware virtualized environment. But I just want to show you some of the other features of this spreadsheet before we jump to that. So there are a number of tabs here. You can go to what's called the Dell EMC PowerEdge wizard. This is, again, a lot of this is very self-explanatory. You can choose, again, some CPUs. Once you've selected your CPUs, and I'm going to go, I just want dual CPU options, it's now going to show you all the PowerEdge servers that have those CPU options and what their performance characteristics are, and also give you an overview of what the competitor spec rates are for those same CPU, but in Fujitsu or a HP BL460C. The other option we have is this RFP pilot. This is, again, it's just a different way of being able to filter everything down. This is a relatively tricky one to use. I'm not going to go into details, but this CPU transition guide is something new and is quite interesting, and it's probably quite a good starting place for a lot of things. So say we know the customer has some existing E5 CPUs. Now, the only problem that we have with the current version of the CPUMeter is that it uses the new SPEC benchmark 2017. Now, the problem we have there is a lot of the older generation CPUs have not been benchmarked against that new standard. So sometimes there's limited value here. What you can do is download the older version of the spreadsheet, which has the 2006 benchmarks, and in that way you can get some of the spec speeds for those older generation CPUs. But then we face the opposite problem, that the new generation CPUs haven't been tested against that old benchmark. But be that as it may, say you've got a customer that's got some E5, some 2650 V4s, and you're looking at putting in a new Intel-based solution again on second generation Xeon Scalable. What this straight away does is give you some ideas on what CPUs you should be looking at. Here's your baseline CPU, or the reference model, and here's what the CPUMeter spreadsheet is suggesting and giving you performance percentage increases over your reference. Now the other tab, and this is the tab that you'll need to use if you want to use my little spreadsheet, is the advanced selector. And it looks a bit crazy, but it's not too bad. So if you want to use this, particularly if you're looking at doing some CPU analysis for a VMware environment, this is how you use this. So select the integer speed, and also if we do a control click here, the integer rate options. And again, I'm just going to go through and say, right, I want an AMD option. I'm going to control click on Intel as well, so we get some Intel options. You've just got to be a little bit slow when you do this here. Excel's doing a lot of lookups and processing in the background, so you just have to take your time as you select these. Again, I'm just going to say, right, give me these current gen EPYC CPUs, and I'm going to do a control click to get access to these second generation scalables. And now we're going to select some CPUs. Now, once you've selected what you're after, to use my pricing and VMware spreadsheet, you need to copy this information right here. So you can copy that information, then we'll pop over to my spreadsheet. So this is my spreadsheet that I've quickly put together. Again, this isn't publicly available, but if you email me or drop me a note on Twitter, then I can give you a copy of this. There's nothing amazing here. We just paste that information in from the other spreadsheet, and I pick up a whole bunch of the information just using some formulas here just to pull this information out. But what we do here is a couple of things. One, when we're sizing for a VMware environment and using those spec benchmarks, VMware have this concept of effective CPUs. So let me show you that. So VMware have this article here called Using Spec to Define a CPU. And in particular, they talk about their strategy for working out the effective CPUs within a server. So their approach is basically right here, where we divide the throughput by the speed rating. So what I've done here in Excel is we have this concept of effective CPUs, which is simply a calculation of throughput divided by speed. And this gives us, again, for that VMware type virtualized environment, their concept of effective CPUs. We can see the raw data for the CPU across here. Now the other thing that we enter in here is the list price or recommended retail for the CPU. We can get this information out of the online solutions configurator. I've just put some values in here for demo purposes, not the actual real amounts. But then what we can see is how much we're paying, so dollars per effective CPU. So now we can start making some decisions. So if a customer was trying to weigh up, do they want the 5220 versus the 5220R? Well, yes, it costs more for that 5220R, but actually your dollars per effective CPU is less. So whilst they paying more up front, they're actually getting effectively more compute power. So it's just a quick demo on how to use the CPU meter spreadsheet, and also my own little personal spreadsheet that I use to help justify some decisions. I hope you found that useful. If you want to know anything else, drop some notes in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you around next time. Cheers.